Hello, and welcome to Beatna at Home 2021, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Tara Byrne, and I'm the Artistic Director of Beatna, Ireland's national festival which celebrates the arts and creativity as we age. The festival is produced by Age and Opportunity, the national development organisation promoting quality of life for all of us aged 50 and upwards. And this year we're delighted to be presenting our second Beatna at Home, and as part of it, I'm very pleased to introduce The Cultures of Aging, the first of our Beatna debate series, which every year aim to generate discussion and reflection on topics relating to age and aging. So this year, we want to explore how different cultures approach and might determine our attitudes to age. Cultures of Aging is chaired by Professor Thomas Scharf, featuring Evan Furlong, Professor Kieran Walsh, Tura Aruturo, and Safinez Busbia. Thomas Scharf is Professor of Social Gerontology at Newcastle University, UK. He was previously Director of the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology, NUI Galway. Tom is currently President of the British Society of Gerontology and is probably best known for his research on issues relating to social inclusion and exclusion in later life. I'd like to finish by thanking Tom and all the panellists in advance, as well as our partners, the Mother Tongues Festival, and the Creative Life programme at the Mercer's Institute for Successful Ageing, St James's Hospital, Dublin, and our core funders, the Arts Council and the HSE. Please check out our other events on the Beatna website and YouTube channels, all available at beatna.ie, and you can also look at ageandopportunity.ie for information on other initiatives. And finally, don't forget to check out our discussion next week on care on Thursday, May the 13th. Over to you, Tom.
There are major challenges around climate change, which sometimes can also be viewed in generational terms. And then we also have the social justice concerns linked, for example, to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So fortunately, I don't have to answer all of these questions myself, that I'm joined by four excellent panelists who are going to help us to understand how aging in later life are viewed in quite different cultural contexts. I'll be talking in a short while to Tura Artura, to Ivan Furlong, and to Kieran Walsh, but I thought we might begin with Safinez Busbia. Safinez was born in Algeria, raised in Switzerland, educated in Oxford and in Dublin. She trained as an architect, but then became a film producer and a director. Her film El Gusto, which premiered in 2012, told the story of an orchestra made up of Jewish and Muslim musicians in Algiers who performed the traditional Chabi music in the 1950s. They went their separate ways and then were reunited when they were aged in their 70s to perform once again. It's an absolutely fascinating story. And since 2014, Safinez has been working with surviving members of the orchestra to integrate musicians from a new generation of Chabi music into the sort of more traditional way of performing. So this is a really fascinating story, Safinez. I wonder, can you just tell us how you came to be interested in working with older musicians who were performing the Chabi music?
Well, thanks to Creative Life and Misa Institute for inviting me to be part of this festival and event. Basically, the story of El Gusto was not really a choice. I was back to the Casbah and Algiers, my place of birth, but I haven't grown up here. And walking in the Casbah with an Irish friend, actually, who's part of Creative Life today at Misa Institute. And we met a mirror maker who invited us in to tell us some stories. And we came across this story of this music class that existed in the 1940s in colonial French times. And the class was completely separated and torn apart when the War of Independence started in the late 50s, and with independence arriving, the 60s, all musicians were torn apart, and I was just fascinated by this piece of history, really not told from a perspective of just musicians. I've always heard about the War of Algeria from a perspective of a military perspective or historical perspective, but this was just a story of a group of people who were just had a common passion for music. And so after having met the surviving member, and they were age, youngest was 72 and the oldest is 96 years of age. And each encounter they had a piece of the history that I was trying to understand. And it was just interesting to see all these men that had this common passion for music, how to live through all the life's ordeals and the difficulties of life. And it just kept them so alive. And it was just their moments for themselves. And it was just fascinating when I told them the news that I was trying to regroup them and reunite them again. Just seeing them come alive was just amazing, because in the rehearsals, they had amazing energy. We worked they were working 16 hours. I just couldn't believe it myself. And then just even more do their dates and then continue with their fans. And I think it's this recognition of this long-awaited public that they met finally, that kind of brought this whole energy back to life in them, I think. And since the release of the album and the film, it was quite difficult to kind of part with some of them. And with the surviving members, I still felt this energy to transmit this art. We embarked on a new adventure, which is we started working since 7 years on this El Gusto 2, where we kind of went looking. I kind of followed historically the footsteps of all the exiled populations of Algeria to, for example, France, Israel, and later to Canada. And we kind of found newer generation musicians that were starting to play a different kind of shabby music, a new contemporary interpretation of it. And we thought it would be interesting to create a dialogue, an intergenerational dialogue between the older generation and the younger one. And we started this project in 2014, and we started recording first. So it was the music traveling. So they hadn't met, so they met by the sound of music. And it was very interesting because they got to know each other by sound. And then when they met each other, it kind of had broken a lot of bridges between them, because they kind of known each other without knowing each other. And we can't hide the fact that between the Algerian and the Israelis, there was a lot of prejudice, seeing the political, historical backgrounds of both. But it was just fascinating to see how music and history and how the older generation helped really create bridges between all the younger generation coming from different cultures. So they were kind of trying to finalize the second project. Sorry, it's a long story, so trying to put it all in a very short.
Well, so, whenever I sort of travel to another country, I'm going to have to avoid going into somewhere and getting into a long conversation that somehow directs the next 15 years of my life or more. But can I just ask, in terms of as a younger person approaching older people and trying to recruit them into a project like this, did you encounter any resistance from some of the older musicians, or were they all just happy to be invited to reunite as part of this orchestra?
The majority of the musicians were very delighted to this idea. Some even believed that it was going to happen, and they were just waiting for it. And very few had lived through quite difficult times, because Algeria had just come out of a civil war when I came into doing this project. So some were very hurt, I'd say, or closed off to the world, and they refused to be part of it. I think it was they couldn't believe it was true. And what helped me bring them along is actually their friends. I just brought one over, and meeting each other, I think they even thought that one was passed away and they didn't even know that the other one was alive. So it was just very emotional to see them all come together. But no, most of them were very, very happy to be part of it.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to some of the lessons that you've learned about aging and aging well after this. But I'd like to move on now to Tura Artura, who is an artist, a commentator, and a filmmaker. And I've been watching some of your material on YouTube over the last weeks, and I'd say really enjoying that. It's it's a really engaging type of material. It plays with cultural norms and cultural traditions. Tura was born in Zimbabwe and is now living in Ballygowan, County Down. He's directing and producing a documentary on the Black Lives Matter events in Northern Ireland in early June of last year. And he's recently received a lot of attention for his online Sean Nós classes. Now, Sean Nós is a traditional form of Irish dance. And Tura has been working online, as many of us have been, training a new generation of people in traditional form of dance. But his concerns relate to enduring impacts of slavery, of colonialism, of neo-colonialism on families, traditions and rituals in non-Western cultures, but also embedded now in the culture of Northern Ireland. So, an obvious question to her really is how does someone who's born in Zimbabwe end up teaching Sean Nós classes in Northern Ireland online? I mean, it's an obvious question, but please, we're all fascinated to hear how that's come about.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be taking part in this conversation. How does somebody from Zimbabwe end up speaking Gaelic and teaching Sean Nós? I guess it's my desire to live an authentic, fulfilled life, but also I am the product of a 16-year-old mother, a single mother, and I was raised by my grandmother. I was breastfed by my grandmother. And in that sense, my grandmother taught me and said to me when I was coming to Ireland, she said, now that you're going to live with other people who have a language of their own and a culture of their own, you must learn their language, because when you learn their language, you will connect with them. And really, it is that desire to connect with Ireland and Irish people. I often say, is a sprage me machine de lacht volum han na Gaelic na, an iracht an stragos han eigna wa ke or in a hain, akas ta hira al a huas again. Nilan gina gyal, nilan gina goromatame kanch up or in a hain. And what I'm basically saying is my desire to learn the nature and the kind of Irish people. Their nature is not about being black or white or being Protestant or Catholic. It's just really about that deeper energy and power as a human being. And I guess learning Irish is part of enabling, and learning Sean Nós is part of that enabling of an experience of Irish life that is authentic. And I guess language as sound was the sound and creation theory. Sound has got such an impact on all of us and everything. And I guess speaking the ancient language of Gaelic connects me with the ancient voices of the land who I wish to connect with, particularly as somebody who practices shamanic traditions from Africa. I hope I answered that question.
You have answered the question and also preempted my next question, really, because I was thinking about those deep connections between cultural traditions on the island of Ireland and in sub-Saharan Africa, and whether whether it's too straightforward to ask whether you can see a relationship between your experiences in Northern Ireland and what you recall in your sort of family traditions in Zimbabwe.
Yes, there is powerful connections with Ireland, so powerful that even the language of Zimbabwe is named Shona. Shona is an Irish girl's name, which means happy. And the links with Ireland are so strong that the Irish missionaries translated the Shona Bible. And so in Zimbabwe, unknown to many Zimbabweans, they use a lot of Gaelic words that people don't actually know it's Gaelic until they actually speak Gaelic. And one of these words is like gera, which means to cut, and it means the same thing in Gaelic as it means in Shona. But much more deeper than that, as colonized people, the Irish people and Zimbabwean people, they've preserved and survived through the preservation of their culture and their rituals and their rites of passage. And that can be seen, with the cultural footprint that Ireland has. I mean, we're a global giant of culture and arts. We stand head and shoulders above others, and all with the backdrop of colonialism, imperialism, and subjugation. And in the same vein, my own tradition in Zimbabwe, we've also fought imperialism and everything else that has come over the last 500 years by preserving our culture and our rites of passage and rituals to almost maintain a kind of sanity. And this is even in the dance of Shanos of the Irish is very much like the dance of my tradition, which is called Makurungunde or Tutentute. And it's a Sena dance. But I think it's the desire of our human nature, this primeval instinct, because even when you look at Kathak, which is an Indian dance, it is really about grounding the body, as dance is the ancient art, the ancient poetry, first ancient poetry, and probably the first religion. So even in Native American traditions, there's this stomping of the feet, dancing or pounding of the ground, and it works in such a way that it has deeper healing properties and connecting properties within a community and culture. And so in that sense, I think Ireland, like Zimbabwe, has not... I'm also in Ireland for about 28 years, so the Zimbabwe that I am recalling is time. But there's a sense for me that Ireland and Zimbabwe have not been so commercialized and stripped of their natural nature as cultural development and experience does, rather than cultural imperialism sort of interfering with some of the traditional things. I think we've maintained quite a lot of the traditional things.
Okay, that's absolutely fascinating, and you're so enthusiastic about these cultural connections between two seemingly very different cultural contexts. But one thing that potentially does unite is that sort of global protest around Black Lives Matters. And I'm just wondering if, you can give us some brief sense of how you came to be involved as an activist in Black Lives Matter, as a social justice platform that is seen sometimes in generational terms as being younger people campaigning for change against a resistant, sort of dominant older culture, if you like. Do you see this in generational terms, or do you see this more as a continuation of a lifelong struggle that successive generations have led?
I believe that it's a continuation of generational struggles. And also, I think one of the things about social media and the developments over the last 10 years has allowed people to capture and share things that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. So it's a multitude of reasons, really, probably one would say. But I think also the fact that, for example, for me to be involved with the Black Lives Matter, I've been involved with the Irish language active. Crim Jarrag is called, and it's the Irish language campaign to get Irish rights written into law in Northern Ireland. With much resistance, it still hasn't happened. So in terms of rights and equality and justice, it's the Black Lives Matter is part of a larger conversation, I believe, which is really about justice, equality for all people, whether it's about biological prejudice, prejudice towards people for their language, their ethnicity, their body, their behavior, their color, their class, and the space and sexuality, the gender. It seems as though Black Lives Matter encapsulates all the prejudices that currently affect us as a global people. And I think it is a vehicle that is able to articulate the prejudices that other people have experienced. And I'm talking about other people, I'm talking about all people who are oppressed and subjugated. So I was asked to speak at the event on the 3rd of June in Belfast by the community, and they insisted, hoping that I'd be able to articulate some of the issues affecting the community in Northern Ireland. And subsequently, I spoke on the 6th of June, and eventually I was interviewed by the police under the Serious Crimes Act, which is a law used to prosecute traffickers, offenders of the most heinous of crimes. So we're talking drug dealers, we're talking sex offenders, we're talking people who are involved in transnational crimes. And this, I believe, was an act to criminalize Black people and Black Lives Matter. And this culture is not something that just happened in Northern Ireland. I mean, as a person who reads on history, you will know that Northern Ireland was Project A. Northern Ireland is where the first plantations were set up. It's where indentured slavery was done. Indentured servitude was done. It's where the empire practiced all its arts of oppression and subjugation, and subsequently the empire spread it around the world with the aid of some Irish gentry. But in terms of, I didn't go off on a tangent there, did I?
You're good. I'm very good at bringing people back into line and focusing on age and culture. But you really, I think there, and we'd like to pick this up shortly in the sort of general discussion, is around where age sits alongside other characteristics in terms of advantage and disadvantage. We're talking here about a more intersectional approach, to use a sociological term, is how age sits alongside gender and social class in terms of structuring the advantage and disadvantage that people face across different cultures, I guess. But that then does still vary from place to place and society to society. But I'd like to move on now, and we'll come back to some of these topics shortly. But I'd like to move on now to Evan Furlong, who moved to Ireland from Taiwan not quite so long ago as Tura did from Zimbabwe. She moved to Ireland in 2000. She's principal of Dublin School of Mandarin Chinese, and she's also currently studying FinTech at the Technological University of Dublin. She teaches Chinese language and culture courses to both primary and to post-primary school age students. And in relation to our discussion today, Evan has a particular interest in intergenerational relations within Asian societies. This speaks to the topic of filial piety, the connections between younger and older generations in terms of care and support that goes across the generations. But can we just start, Ivan, by you telling us about your journey to Ireland and how you came to the School of Mandarin Chinese in Dublin?
Okay. Dear Eve, Ivan Furlong is Anandam. That's all the Guelga I have. Thanks for having me, by the way, Beltana Committee and the Mother Tongue Festival. Thank you. I moved to Ireland as an intra-corporate transfer between the two. At that time, the Celtic Tiger, in year 2000. And so there are a lot of international companies, for example, Ericsson and Intel. They were allowed, like the government kind of promoting immigrants. So I had an intra-corporate transfer visa, if you like. So I moved to Ireland back then. So that's the reason brought me here.
And you're mainly teaching the Chinese language to younger students. But how receptive would you say your students are to learning more than language and learning about sort of Chinese or Asian culture, in your case, maybe Taiwanese culture that really goes hand in hand with the language? But I'm just wondering whether whether these are resistant learners or whether they really are more interested in the cultural aspects of Asian society rather than the language itself.
Well, definitely. I was on the NCCA, the subgroup for the curriculum. So culture does play a big part in all kind of foreign language learning. So for what we do is normally, this is before the pandemic, we will have 2 hours on a Saturday, like every heritage language school. So the first hour, the student will be sitting in their own peer group, whatever the level they're on. And then the second hour, we'll be doing fun stuff, hands-on cultural studies and stuff like that. And I think that had attracted a lot of students, we do cookings and calligraphy, Chinese painting, you name it. And I do think culture plays a big part in any kind of language learning. Yeah.
And you're also a lifelong learner yourself. So what brought you into the study of fintech? Was this something that you were interested in before you came to Ireland, or is it a passion that has developed in the time since you've been in Dublin?
I don't think fintech existed 20 years ago. It's only kind of like I suppose PayPal would be the first one, which is kind of the first fintech technology, if you like. That was in 1998 or 1999, I think. So the reason I wanted to study is we have the old saying in Chinese, 活到老,学到老, means, living, learning to live and living to learn, that kind of thing. So I think it's very important in terms of the culture of aging. We never stop learning. Doesn't matter it's the formal, in class, or whether it's the channel dancing or learning another skills, if you like. I think it's very important that we have this in our culture. Doesn't matter what age you are, you just keep on learning and learning new things. I think will keep us young.
Well, we in my line in social gerontology, we refer to this as the deinstitutionalization of the life course. It's a complex way of just saying that you really can do anything at any age and not be constrained by your chronological age. Is why not start something new later on in life? Come back to education, come back and do things that you couldn't do earlier on in your life. And that's a neat bridge for me to introduce Kieran Walsh. Kieran is Professor of Aging and Public Policy and Director of the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology at NUI Galway. His research focuses on a range of topics, including the dynamics of social exclusion in later life, public and social policy on aging, the places where people age, as well as features of formal and informal care in aging societies. I obviously know Kieran quite well, having gone back a number of years from my time in NUI Galway. And I'm just personally keen, but I think other people may be keen, as a researcher on aging, Kieran. How do you think your work connects to aging in different cultures? Do you think that it's a trend in gerontology is to look at aging in different types of societies across cultural contexts? I'm just wondering how your work on exclusion, on advantage and disadvantage, reaches beyond the Irish context, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much, Tom, and thanks to Bealtaine for inviting us all here. So I suppose there's a number of different ways. I mean, one of the things is about, I guess, the production of that culture, the how that culture manifests in different places, and how it can be constrained, or how different opportunities can be there for it to flourish a little bit. I think in so many different ways, particularly when you think about questions of exclusion and questions of inclusion, it really does come down to culture quite a lot. And I suppose that would be certainly kind of maybe evident very much in some of our recent work around particular groups. So, for instance, indigenous ethnic groups, such as the older Irish travellers, but also other groups that have less of a focus of a cultural identity and more around a culture of shared practice, shared experiences, such as older homeless adults as well. But a lot of our research would shed insight and would certainly capture insight into other broader questions about how marginalized populations in different contexts and different jurisdictions can be included or excluded on the basis of their culture in various different ways. And I suppose what we've found over maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years of research and some of what you've been involved with as well, Tom, is that a lot of the older generations that we are interviewing are people who are, if you like, both kind of actors of cultural production in the traditional sense of arts, of creativity, of some of the elements that the other speakers have mentioned. But also they very much are the transmitters of that to different generations, but they're also the resistors of factors that can impinge on maybe the dilution of that culture or the changes that might be happening to that. Whether this is a group of people living in very remote parts of Ireland who are resistant to various different changes such as technology or anything like that, where there is certainly a call to try and preserve some of the old traditional music scene or house visiting or anything like that, which used to be called Scriox or Céilís, or whether it's more directly related to ethnic identity and rights, such as older travellers who have expressed real dismay at the erosion of their cultural identity and how that kind of has created a sense of loss for them and impacted on their well-being. So it comes up frequently, it comes up quite a lot, and I suppose the other thing is that it also produces another sort of platform for comparison across jurisdictions, and that's really important considering how diverse aging populations are and how difficult it is to make those comparisons sometimes. So we've just heard Tura very well describing some of the connections that he feels are there between Ireland and Zimbabwe, but it allows us to think about these connections that maybe go a little bit more than just a surface level. So it provides a means for us to really get into in depth in terms of some of the values, some of the really important issues that are driving people's experiences in later life.
I think the work with older travellers is absolutely fascinating, because one of the things it reveals is the multiple cultures of aging, if you like, that exist on the island of Ireland. That a lot of what we try to do is to move away from treating older people and aging this homogenous characteristic. So, and in terms of older travelers, of course, this is a population that historically is not very well long lived, is that relatively small proportions of older travelers sort of reach what we would regard as an advanced old age, if you like. And I'm just wondering, whether there are any particular, I know this is a difficult question, but whether any particular lessons that your research has revealed about the aging well of older travelers, as how do they, how is meaning attributed to their lives? And thinking here, about the work that sort of Safia Nez was referring to earlier in terms of older musicians with passing something on to the next generation, maintenance of friendships across time. I'm just wondering, in terms of the travellers, whether whether there's something that can be learned from the way in which they approach aging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there, I suppose, be kind of three pillars that would stand out for us in terms of how people would express this kind of cultural identity. And this would be around religion and faith for older travelers, but also around a nomadic stroke kind of outdoor focus in terms of life. But also then within that, this craft and creativity as well. And I guess those three elements combined would certainly often be expressed as kind of fundamental ways to live your life well, and particularly in later life. So it kind of gives you an insight into the sort of continuity that people are interested in preserving across their life as well, which is a part of their cultural identity, but which they would also see as being intrinsic to their individual life experience. And that's not me trying to generalize across that, but I think it's really important. I suppose one thing just to think about, and as we were talking about intersectionality and all these different elements, is that certainly what would stand out to me, whether it's a group like Older Irish Travellers or mainstream older population, is that you obviously have the culture that comes from a particular ethnic identity or a particular group such as that. But you also then have that cohort set of conditions that people have lived through. And often that produces its own culture and that its own rhythm and routine of life as well. And then you also have, I suppose, the culture that can come from different places. And that's obviously in a national context. But as we've seen in Ireland, as Tura might have talked about in the context of Northern Ireland, as some of the others have talked about in their jurisdictions, it can be very local based. And I think all those three things mapped on together gives you a really interesting fabric and tapestry to try and unpack as well.
Okay. Well, thanks to all of the panelists so far that we've met you. We know a little bit about the work that you're doing and the types of topics that you're interested in. So I'd like to now open up the discussion and bring it back to these broad ways in which aging is often represented in society as a sort of challenge. And it's presented in this dual way as, on the one hand, aging is often seen as a problem, as a set of health conditions, as costs to society arising from social care and pensions. But on the other hand, we try to represent aging as something positive arising from extended life courses, increasing longevity, growing numbers of people reaching later life in good health, in work, with money to spend on consumer items. Now, these are really simplistic perspectives that really vary from place to place and across societies. I'm just wondering how those sort of twin perspectives relate to your own experiences of aging or your own views of aging from your particular backgrounds. I don't know whether, Ivan, you would like to, you're nodding your head there, whether you'd like to add something there.
Sure, thanks. Growing up in Taiwan in the 70s, it's quite different now, I say. But I remember I had this sweet memory of living with my grandparents on my mother's side, where my parents actually working in another city. So I only see them at the weekend. And I have this sweet memory with my grandparents, me and my two younger siblings, we are the oldest grandchildren, if you like. So we kind of like that, we are the center of attention, until my uncle's wife got her first child. So we kind of downgraded then, And then that was then when I got my first unpaid job. I had to because I'm the oldest in the grandchildren's generation. So I'm the oldest at that time. I think I was 6. So I got my first unpaid job to mind the cousin, basically. But I think that sort of culture, it's kind of like transcending from the Confucianism, like filial piety. It's a core virtue of, if you believe in Confucianism, okay? And we also in Taiwan, we have this old saying goes, 家有一老，如有一宝. Meaning having an elder in the house is like having a treasure in the family. So it's very often, it's very common still today that the 3 generations will live together. Because a very, like in the modern days, most younger Taiwanese couple now, they'll be both working. So then they need someone to look after their children, So I guess you could say like a Taiwanese, unless they're being a parents twice, they are not allowed to complain about aging. They have to be parents once, and then they mind their grandchildren as a parent. So they have to experience this.
And what about the responsibilities then that are given to sort of male to grandsons and granddaughters, as opposed, in terms of the gender division there? Is it still are there still substantial differences that characterize, the obligations
not so much
towards?
Yeah, not so much in Taiwan. But I think in China, I read an article recently. That the aging population it's affecting the world now. Because the one birth policy in China, although like they changed it to two children in 2017, I think, but the Asian population is already there. It's already existing. And also I think it's more prevalent in China because, like you say, like there's a gender imbalance that the people prefer to have a boy to carry the family name. Therefore, also they're allowed to have abortion. So therefore, I think there are 34. I think I read it somewhere just a couple of days ago. There are 34 million more young men than women. So I think it's a big problem, this gender imbalance. But not so much in Taiwan. So yeah, I hope I have answered your question.
No, that's great. No, it's going to just sort of pick up then with Safinez on that. Dual view of aging as being either a problem or as an opportunity. I'm not sure how does that relate to your experience in Algeria or the experience of the work you've been doing?
Well, I'm Algerian of birth, but I've never lived here. But when I came back with El Gusto, I got to know as well not only my country, but also my family and my grandmother especially. My grandmother actually is still alive. She's 103. And she's basically amazing, where she's the center of the family. And this is what I noticed over here. Having lived in so many different cultures, I don't know if it's really about culture or it's about generations and an epoch. Like I got the chance to live in Ireland in the early 2000s, and I got to know so many different grandparents and Irish grandparents, and the place of an older person in the family has evolved with the people moving to the cities and with the pace that we live in today and having no time for anything. And it's just the family values have changed. And I see it through how over here it's still, I mean, as in Taiwan, things have been changing and are changing. Same thing in Algeria. But like in Africa in general, aging is not a huge subject right now because it's a very young population, but it will become in the next 20, 30 years for sure, because people are moving to the cities, having less children. So basically, it's going to inverse the graph. But coming back to my personal experience with aging in Algeria, where the family values are about the older people being, like in Taiwan, a treasure. So there isn't a lot of old people area, so they're very treasured. What I think so helps them age so well is the fact that they're in the center of the life, of everyday life. They're not like, we don't go pay a visit to our grandparents. They're they're in the home. They decide. They have this. It's very funny, but because there's this relationship that's created between the older people and the younger ones, is that the older people are there to protect you, so they have a responsibility more than us. We have a duty. They have the responsibility. So it's an incredible motivation, because like I have conversations with my grandmother when she goes, but what do you mean? I'm not going anywhere because I have to take care of this and this and this. And I think this keeps them so alive. And from my experience with El Gusto is also that, I don't know, I have a problem with the as Kieran said, is grouping older people, because in one orchestra, they were, yes, all older people, but they were so different one from another. It's a personality thing, and it's how you grow older, and it's how your attitude to life, and it's also to do with your environment, your direct environment. It's true that where you come from impacts a lot, but I think it's your direct environment that impacts a lot the way you age. It's how I think, when I started this project, I had this vision where we have to help older people. And after living this experience, I don't think it's about helping them. They don't necessarily need help. They just need a space to exist, and not as a secondary part of society, but just as part of society.
I've worked in aging a long time, and one of my passions is encouraging people to become gerontologists. But the way in which you've expressed that view there, Safina, is really, there are hundreds and thousands of scientific papers written that essentially say what you've just said there about the diversity and the risks of homogenizing older people and treating, just on the basis of chronological age, treating people as being similar. And really what we have to focus on is the diversity of people's backgrounds and their experiences. And I think this tour is probably an area that you also, that I think grandparents are featuring grandmothers are featuring quite heavily in the conversation so far. But how do you, just in that sort of broad terms, sort of view the position of older people in society? You talked earlier about that intersectional approach. Does that shape how you view aging and the relationship between generations?
Yes, I do see, particularly in my instance where my grandmother raised me, and my grandmother taught me my values and principles and my view of the world. She taught me the family lineage. She taught me family history. She passed on oral tradition to me. She passed on rituals. She passed on knowledge and wisdom. And without that link between generations, there's going to be a void. There is a void that is left. And for that reason, some of the concerns I have over, the neo-colonial experience is that it commercializes and it takes away that natural order of society and packs people into commodities. And this is the difficulty with cultures where everybody is seen as a customer, and old people are seen as customers for the social services, and the social policy is designed in such a way that it treats people as customers. So in that sense, my own experience with my grandmother was really about teaching me about life. And I think I negotiate life easier because whenever I get into a difficult place, I just go back to what would my granny say? What would my granny do? And for me, having that bank of knowledge means nothing phases me, because I have a source. I have a source of narrative and a source of knowledge and wisdom, which really is a shield. And without that shield, then there is a loss, a void, which leaves people empty. And that is the impact that I think the slavery and colonial experience has impacted on communities and cultures. You know, we thought we were progressing and developing, when in actual fact, we were losing our sense of self and essence of self as a people.
Okay. And there's a question that's coming from the audience from Joe Tierney, it's targeted at you, Tura, but I'm thinking it's a question for everybody, and it's really the simple question: is there endemic ageism in Ireland? Isn't a definition of ageism there, but do you think that ageism, sort of discrimination against older people and also potentially against younger people, do you think this is a structural feature of society in Ireland or of other societies that you've experienced?
I could talk for my family, my experience with my grandmother when she lived here.
Well, go ahead, yes. There's no right and wrong answers here. Just approach it how you would like to.
So ageism as a product of imperial capitalism, because it sets generations against each other in competition for resources. So whether it's in Africa or whether it's in Ireland, I saw it even with the way that, for example, my own grandmother, when she was here, her children treated her like a child, like her opinion didn't matter. She was being taken care of. And eventually she was neglected because there were difficulties of culture for the family negotiating things that were needed to be done for herself. What she wanted was not what she was getting. And it is this intersectionality of cultures which my uncles and aunties were negotiating, which my grandmother couldn't even negotiate, couldn't even speak the language. So I found it for myself, when my personal involvement with my grandmother was stopped, I was banned from seeing my grandmother because I raised hell every time when I seen something was not right. If a catheter was not put right, I would complain. If something was not done right, I would complain. And I became we don't want the grandson here because he's complaining too many times. And that commodifying of people is actually destroying the family ties that are naturally needed to be there to help the mind. As older people age, they need young people to interact with to keep them healthy. Dementia has only increased because of that lack of connection and contact. A lot of other mental health things that my grandmother suffered were because she was lacking in contact, and she was towards the end, she was all alone in a foreign land with people who spoke a foreign language.
Okay. Safinez, you're moving on to sort of an intergenerational program now. And in the interactions between the younger musicians and the older musicians, are they marked by respect, or do you sometimes sense, sort of these ageist views about different expectations about what people should or might be doing at a particular stage of life?
Well, culturally, yes, there is a lot of respect, because in our cultures, we respect the older people. So to start with, of course, there's that in place. But the relationship started like a grandchild to a grandparent. But then very soon later, these people are not our grandparents. They're rock and roll. They're rockers. They want to party. They don't have that same relationship that we would have with our grandparents. And then they soon became more our friends. But what was fascinating from a humanist perspective is an intergenerational dialogue with this generation has lived in the 40s, the 50s. It was so used to living with so many different nationalities. They were very tolerant, open to coexistence, open, very curious to other people. And then yet you have this younger generation that spends their time talking about coexistence and tolerance. Yet we live very few of it, if I may say, in the sense it's more about theory and form and what's politically correct and not majorly about just really getting to know and communicating with each other. Older generation, what it did is really it opened the way younger generation to connect to each other and break all these prejudices. But what was interesting as well is how they collaborated together, because the older generation was physically needed some assistance to carry the very heavy instruments and stuff. And the older generation knew much more about music. So there was kind of a reciprocal exchange between the knowledge and the physical, and they did it very well, and it complemented them very well. And it just gave this sense of authenticity to the music and this modernity. And I thought the work, the collaboration together made this music, gave this music soul. I find their presence that's what it did to the second album. But I think it's really today the younger generation. It was just funny because today Algeria is living a new revolution where, like everywhere else, people are out on the streets demanding rights and so on. I attended a conversation between an older musician and a younger one talking about revolution in general, because these older musicians went down to the streets in the 50s and asked for their liberation as well, in a revolution too. So they were discussing comparing the two revolutions and the two epochs. And it was interesting because what the older musician said was that back then they had values and morals and they were defending them. And today, he loves this new energy of people requesting something new, but he finds that this generation is a bit looking for these values and looking back to certain understandings and looking for something to hold on. And it was just interesting having this transmission between the older generation and the younger. It felt like it helps to continue this continuation that we're all meant to do. Life is not about a start or an end, it's about a continuation. And that's why these transmission bridges need to exist. And that's why we don't have to seclude older people on the side. They are part of this transmission and part of this continuity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to pick up on that with Kieran in terms of the older traveller population, about those intergenerational ties, and whether respect for age is a feature in traveller families, and how is that represented, or is the how are older travellers, I wouldn't say looked after because that's a very patronizing way of describing it, but what is the position of older family members with it in terms of those intergenerational connections, those family ties?
Yeah, I think at a very general level, it's very strong, and it's very much like what some of the others have described here as being very much at the fulcrum of kind of the family household and so on. And for that reason, then there's a lot of emphasis being placed on terms of things like support giving to older travellers. But also, I think some of that is probably running a risk of doing a few things. And one, it's maybe generalising across what is still quite a large community. And I suppose it also masks a lot of the issues that are facing older travellers in so many different ways. And I think what people are very concerned about is that, people aren't able to get the sort of supports that they need, particularly given the sort of disadvantage and marginalisation that people have lived through and the sort of needs that they've accumulated over their lives. So families would be very concerned for that respect as well. I think more generally, though, there is always in Ireland, both in the traveller community and more broadly, there was always this idea that we were living in very close-knit, supportive communities. This idea of these multi-generational households was very strong. But I guess there is that need to maybe critique that a little bit and to think about why those multi-generational households were existing. And particularly this might be something that's common with some of the others here as well, where there wasn't the sort of supports available to families or to older people to actually provide sufficient care and sufficient support to them. And in some ways, going back to your question about ageism, I think there is ageism in all societies. I think what there is more of, perhaps, is a bit of a complacency towards older populations. And sometimes there's a kind of a sidelining of agency a little bit. And we've seen that in the last 12 months, particularly around COVID, that lack of voice. But that goes back to what Safinez was saying about these channels that are really important, not just for intergenerational transmission of values, of ideas, of knowledge, of kind of creating these relationships, but these kind of platforms that exist that allow us to live in the now a little bit. So we often have the example here of the GEA, so Gaelic Athletics Association, and the fact that you have this platform where there isn't a lot of intergenerational opportunities, where you have different generations coming together and producing something together. And I think that's the same in what Safinez and what the others are describing, that, it is a bit about transmitting a knowledge, but it's also about taking that knowledge and producing something new, which is really important. And that's one thing that has always been in Ireland and other places, that recognition that older people are really important actors and have an awful lot of agency around culture and the arts, both in terms of preserving that, but in terms of resisting some of those changes, in terms of using them for different kind of protest ideas. And I think we probably need to take some of those lessons and some of those insights and transfer them to other areas of life, because we still got reasonably low expectations for what it is to age and for later life. And I think we need to raise those expectations. And the last element is, Tura mentioned there that sometimes there's this pitting of generations against each other. Well, we've just had a green paper on aging at a European level, kind of forecasting what areas we should concentrate on. And they take a life cycle approach, but they really kind of divide the life stages as opposed to taking a more under kind of a broader life course approach that really links people's lives. And that looks at how, the policies that we're making today for older people or for younger generations impact on other generations in different ways. And we really need to look about this as creating shared experiences as opposed to creating different sets or segregated experiences as well. Sorry, Tom, I think I did go off on a rant there now.
Well, I don't know, because as you were talking there, I was thinking about all of the things that I feel I've learned over the last 12 months. And, in terms of the experience of ageism and the way in which it is so deep-rooted within society that older people's basic rights to a family life, to freedom of movement, to who they socialize with, access to care and services, all of these important features of daily life have been restricted basically based on chronological age. So I've, been transitioning towards a more human rights approach to aging policy, aligned with the work around sort of disabled persons' rights. And for me, that's quite a big change, because I always historically thought that, a United Nations convention focusing on older people would itself be ageist in terms of providing rights to people based on age. But what we've seen is the the complete disregard of many people's basic rights without these types of instrument. I'm editorializing here, but this is the journey I've taken. I don't know, Kieran, whether you have a view on that.
No, I think something similar. I think it just shows us that any vehicle that allows us to articulate that a little bit stronger, whether it is about a rights convention specifically for older people or not, we need to kind of go further down that conversation. I think what's really interesting about it is that it just shows the last 12 months how tentative people's voice was and how tentative our connections to society were, and with a couple of kind of general policies, certainly you weren't hearing from the vocal leaders within your local community because they were cocooning or whatever else. But the other thing that I suppose is really difficult to try and appreciate, especially in the context of today's conversation, is that, you know, in the last 2 days, we've had a ruling that says that the state was not fulfilling its obligations in terms of accommodation for older travelers or homeless or traveler people, not older, but it's a part of it. And then you map that on to everything that's been happening in the last 12 months. And you just think about, you know, there are some groups who are really, really curtailed by these rights violations that have been going on for so long. And I think they are a part of our normative culture that we need to probably call out and address a little bit more.
So I've got my eye on the time here, and I'm aware that we'll be stopping very soon. But what I'd like to do is to give each of you a chance to, you know, give some final thoughts on the topic or on anything that's on your mind at the moment. So I'm going to start maybe with Ivan to have some final thoughts on aging and culture, or anything else that's come up in the conversation.
Sure. Thank you. I'm a true believer of Confucianism, and I really believe in filial piety. I know it's not very like a common sense at all. Like my especially like, you know, the young people, they never heard of, like, I've been teaching filial piety as a subject of philosophy to my transition year students, and none of them have heard of these words. So but I'm a true believer in this, you know. I just want to say something really quickly in terms of support and policy. Perhaps, like in Singapore, the Minister of Social and Family Development introduced the Maintenance of Parents Act that allows Singapore resident who's over age of 60, if they can provide for themselves, they can claim allowance from their children. You know, I think something like that, it's remarkable, you know. And I believe last year, Shanghai in China, they passed a law requiring children to visit parents in the nursing home. Stuff like that, I think, you know, I really believe in filial piety, and I think we should put that in our education.
Well, that's something we can take away. Tura, I'll give you a chance also to say some final words.
Thanks, Tom. I just want to echo what Kieran was saying earlier on about how the different cultures in Ireland and Africa seem to have the same essence in terms of how they express the journey of cultural development. But also in terms of older people, I want to say that older people in Ireland are the salt of the earth. And you can see that. You can see how when you go for a trad evening, or when you have rites of passage, a death or birth celebration, older people are at the heart of it. And that's an Irish tradition, and also that's an African tradition. And I believe it's a shared tradition as in all communities. Really, the ones that have the wisdom and the knowledge are the parents, the grandparents. So aging celebrated through art and culture, and the relationship between generations harnessed through sharing spaces and experiences, and the emergency of the Black Lives Matter as a vehicle for all humanity. We go to the people who are the worst affected, and when we uplift them, we uplift everybody else. So in terms of the general statement that I want to leave you with, Tom, is that old people have been young and continue to be young eternally. They have that core essence and value which they pass on to the young, and that has to be nurtured.
Thank you, Tura. Safinez, I'm sure you can relate to that point as well from your own experience.
Oh, completely.
Is there something you would like to add by way of conclusion?
Well, for me, I think I would like aging to be not about age, but to be about just each one of us, just as an individual case, not just as a group. And it's not about age, because from my experience, from my yoga classes, I have a member in the yoga class who's 83, and she's actually more fit than I am. So how do you explain that? Or my grandmother at the age of 102 last year, who sewed up 60 masks for the medical teams in the hospital. I mean, would you call these people inactive or older? I don't know. It's I would like aging to be considered not an age thing.
Okay, that's
and I think
great.
we could also, I would just add one thing, is I think it's not just also about authorities and rights and stuff. I think we all can participate, every one of us, in helping this aging process. In this, I think it's by sharing, consideration, and collaboration, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll give almost the last word to Kieran. Is there anything you would like to finish up with?
I think everybody has said different facets of what I was going to say. So really, for me, perhaps it's just about, I think we all need to kind of raise our expectations for what we can expect in later life, particularly around that participation idea. And I think it's really fitting that Bealtaine does kind of demonstrate this through the arts and creativity and the focus on that. Because I do think that's one of the spheres there is really strong. So I think we should really just set bigger goals for ourselves in older age, and also to think about these goals as being relevant to everybody. So not just in terms of kind of the standard mainstream older populations, but also the most marginalized within our societies, to really embrace their experiences as a part of what could be a good older life.
I think that's a lovely way to sort of end our conversation in terms of being more ambitious, not just about aging in society as a whole, but also in terms of our own aging, and not to accept second best. So we're going to finish on that point. And I would just like to thank Safinez Bousbir, Tura Artura, Ivan Furlong and Kieran Walsh for joining me in what I've really enjoyed as a fascinating conversation. It's gone by incredibly quickly. I'm sure we could do this again and look at some other important cultural dimensions. But thank you all for joining the discussion. Thank you to the team at Bealtaine for inviting us along today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.